Postmodernism, postmodern theory, what's it all about? If you're a PhD student in the social sciences, the chances are you've come across the term postmodernism and you've thought to yourself, what on earth does this mean? You are not alone. You might have seen postmodernism and postmodern theory and thought, are these the same thing? They are closely connected, but they're not exactly the same. Postmodernism is the big picture cultural shift, the move away from traditional ideas about truth and certainty. It shows up in everything, from architecture to advertising. Now, postmodern theory, on the other hand, is about how academics make sense of this shift. It's a set of ideas that are used in research to make sense of things like identity, media, power, and consumer culture. In this video, I'm going to talk about both, but I'm going to focus mostly on the implications for research. If we've not met before, hi, I'm Dr. Elizabeth Yardley, and I am here to help you finish your PhD. In the 2 decades that I've been supporting postgraduate students, theory has been a huge stumbling block for most people. And people seem to get particularly stuck when it comes to postmodern theory. It feels a bit mysterious. It's got some unique stuff in it, like deconstruction. But some of these concepts, some of these ideas, they are nowhere near as complicated as you might think they are. Deconstruction is like taking apart a complicated gadget to see how the pieces work, and noticing that some of the parts don't quite fit. So postmodern theory has got a bit of a reputation. It's often seen as abstract and confusing and heavy on the jargon. But beneath some of the rather complex terminology are a set of ideas that are really useful in terms of making sense of how people see the world, especially a world filled with contradictions and competing perspectives and a dizzying amount of information. No matter what you're studying, postmodern theory gives you a toolkit to question things and embrace complexity. It helps us learn to love the mess. Let's unpack it step by step, no jargon, with lots of relatable examples. Postmodernism is a way of looking at the world that challenges the idea that there's one truth or there's one way of understanding things. Instead, it argues that reality is messy. It argues that people essentially make it up as they go along. People tell stories that are all a bit or a lot different from each other. If modernism, which was the movement that came before, was all about order and structure and logic and progress, then postmodernism is like coming along, looking at that manual and raising an eyebrow, saying, but who wrote this and what did they leave out? Think of a jigsaw puzzle. Modernism believes that if you work hard enough, you'll complete the puzzle and see the full picture. Postmodernism suggests, what if the puzzle has missing pieces, or multiple ways to assemble it, or pieces from entirely different puzzles just chucked in there? It asks a lot of awkward, challenging questions like that. So how did postmodernism come about? Now, I always say that any theory holds up a mirror to the world that it emerges from. When you look at a theory and you really examine it, that theory will tell you a lot about the period of history it developed within. Postmodernism is no exception. It didn't just emerge out of the ether. It grew to prominence in the mid to late 20th century, and it reacted to some of the big shifts that were happening in society at the time. World War II, the Cold War, rapid technological advancements, globalisation, mass media. But perhaps most importantly, postmodernism was a pushback. It pushed back against that optimistic certainty that characterised modernism. It challenged the belief that science and rationality and progress would make life better for everyone. Thinkers like Foucault and Derrida started to ask questions like, who is this progress really for? Whose knowledge is being prioritised? Who gets to decide what counts as truth? Postmodernism shines a light on power structures, so things like organisations, corporations, businesses, universities, and asks how they shape our ideas of truth, of reality, of normality. And at the time postmodernism developed, people were starting to question these grand narratives, those big sweeping stories like science will solve all of the world's problems, or capitalism guarantees freedom for everyone. The postmodern thinkers came along and they started to question these claims. They pointed out the contradictions where things didn't quite fit. They gave attention to the voices of people who'd previously been silenced. Let's break down some of the key postmodern concepts that you're likely to come across. First up, relativism. And this is the idea that there are many truths, there's not just one. Postmodernism argues that truth is not absolute, and what feels true for you will depend on your perspective, your culture, and your experience. For example, if you were to ask 5 different people about their views on remote working, you'd likely get 5 different answers, none of which is the definitive truth. For some, it's liberating, for others, it's isolating, for others, it's a combination of the two. Postmodernism encourages us to respect and explore these multiple truths. Next up is the social construction of reality. So the postmodernists believe that people construct reality, people make the world the way it is. They are constantly engaged in the process of making meaning. So meanings and realities and truths, these are not fixed things. Okay, they are constantly under construction, they're constantly being negotiated between different people. For example, money is a social construction. It only has value because we collectively agree that it has value. And without that shared belief, coins would just be pieces of metal. Notes would just be bits of paper. A bank balance would just be numbers on a screen. It's the fact that we attach meaning to those numbers, we attach a value to those numbers that make it real. Next up, the rejection of grand narratives. Postmodernism is really sceptical of these big, all-encompassing ways of making sense of things, like grand narratives and grand theory. I did a video about these recently, and I will link to it on the screen right now. I'll also pop it in the description for later. Instead, postmodernism focuses on smaller, more localised stories, sometimes called micro-narratives. For example, rather than just accepting the story that economic growth always benefits society, postmodernist thinkers ask, who benefits? Who doesn't benefit? What are the hidden costs? Lastly, hyperreality. Hyperreality means that our world is so filled with media that the pictures and the stories that we see often seem more convincing, more real than real life itself. Think of a travel influencer's Instagram feed. The perfectly filtered beaches and sunsets often feel more appealing than the real, messy experience of travel, with delays and crowds and cancelled flights and sunburn and treading in unpleasant stuff on the beach. That's hyperreality in action. Before we get on to the next part of the video, I want to hear from you in the comments about all things theory. I want to know what general social science theories you're stuck on. Which ones have you never been able to get your head around? And the reason I want to know this is because I want to make some videos about them. So get typing, let me know what theory or theories you've always struggled with, and I will put together a series of videos all about them. Okay, so far you might be thinking, well, this is all very interesting, but what has it got to do with my research? Here's how postmodern theory might apply to your work. First up, it helps you question assumptions. Rather than taking concepts like leadership, success, or progress at face value, postmodernism pushes you to ask, well, who defines these terms? Who do these terms benefit? Are there competing concepts or understandings? Next up, it embraces complexity. The social world is rarely straightforward. The postmodern approach equips you really well for handling that ambiguity and for thinking about those competing narratives. Also, it makes room for marginalised voices. Postmodern theory encourages us to look at perspectives that might have been overlooked by modern theories, whether that's minority groups, grassroots movements, informal economies. It helps us to look for and listen to the voices of those people. And crucially, it puts lived experience right in the middle of everything. Postmodern theory reminds us that the experiences of individuals are valid and valuable sources of knowledge, even if they don't fit into neat traditional categories. So it can fit quite nicely with qualitative research methods, which I did another video on a while ago. I'll link to it on the screen right now, and I'll pop it in the description for later. And it can be quite useful to look at postmodernism in context, to compare it to the modern approach that came before it. See what's similar, see what's different. And on the screen right now, I'm going to pop a little table up there with some of the main differences. So feel free to take a screenshot of this and save it for later if you want to have a deeper dive into these differences. In the meantime, let's think about what a postmodern approach to research might look like with some examples. Let's say you were looking at consumer culture. Think about brand loyalty. Postmodernism suggests that consumers aren't just buying products, they're buying identities, stories, and meanings. So somebody buys an Apple iPhone not just for a phone, but for what that brand represents: creativity, innovation, status. And a postmodern study into social media influencers might look at how they curate a hyper-real version of their lives. It might examine the ways in which their feeds blend authenticity and performance, blurring the lines between reality and representation, and their followers would be engaging with the image of the person as much as or more than the real person behind it. You might look at organisational culture. Organisations often promote grand narratives like, we're all a family here. And postmodernism would invite you to unpack that. Is it genuinely inclusive? Or is it used to encourage overwork and loyalty? Now, as with any theory, postmodernism is not without its critics. So let's take a look at some of the main ones and the things that you might say to counter those. It's too pessimistic. Postmodernism can seem a bit bleak because it deconstructs those stories that we are so familiar with. But it's not necessarily pessimistic. It invites us to see the possibilities in diversity and in difference. It's vague and hard to apply. Postmodern ideas can seem a bit abstract. And the key is to use them as lenses, not prescriptions. Think of postmodern theory as a set of glasses that you're putting on to look at the world. They're not about providing you with all the answers. They're about prompting you to ask different questions, to see things in a new light. It leads to anything goes. Some people argue that postmodernism is just a mess. It rejects all standards. In practice, though, it encourages thoughtful critique, because recognising multiple viewpoints, for example, doesn't mean that all of those viewpoints are equally valid. It means we need to evaluate them carefully. It helps us identify them. And if you take one thing away from this video, let it be this. Postmodernism doesn't give you a tidy answer, but it does give you permission to sit with complexity, to notice the contradictions, and to appreciate the diverse ways in which people make sense of their worlds. You don't have to resolve every tension that you find. You don't have to make everything you discover fit into a neat category or a neat box. Instead, you can acknowledge the messiness of real life and produce research that feels honest, that feels reflective and deeply thoughtful. And talking of the word reflective, I've got a video popping up on the screen now that you might be interested in, because it looks at the difference between reflective and reflexive. There are so many terms, aren't there, in social sciences, so many of them that sound really similar but actually mean quite different things, and reflective and reflexive are one of those pairings. So go and check it out. I'll see you in there.